What we're looking at this morning, as the title shows, is the account of the raising of Lazarus. And according to John's account of these things, this miracle happens right before the triumphal entry, very soon before it. And this miracle sits alongside the feeding of the 5,000, which happened earlier in his ministry, as among the most impactful in his ministry, where people walked away and realized that they were dealing with the Messiah. It caused them to respond to him in that way. John's gospel indicates that it greatly contributed to the excitement waiting for him in the city. It was, that is to say, according to John, the triumphal entry, the way they received him, was in no small part due to the fact that the raising of Lazarus was on their minds. We also see in this text that it was also a primary motivator for the religious leaders to put into action plans to crucify him. And both of those things are true at the same time, and it's interesting. But what we're going to do is we're going to read this account first, and it's long, but we're going to go ahead and read through it. And then we're going to unpack the messianic attributes of Jesus that are on display in it, which are absolutely fascinating. So we'll read it first, then we'll unpack the messianic attributes. So follow along with me as I read. Bear with me. I got the small print in front of me, and I got the bifocals on. I've tried, but I've never been great at this. I should probably delegate this to other people in the future. We can always edit out mistakes. Lord, forgive me now. Now, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sister sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. He said this he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Then Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us now go to him. Therefore Thomas, who was called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, so that we may die with him. Always the optimist with Thomas. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Mary, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him. But Martha did that. Mary stayed at the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give to you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Now, when she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw Mary, got up quickly and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going up to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, and she saw him and fell at his feet, she said to him, Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping also, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled, and he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what had been done believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. We're going to stop there. We'll reference the verses following as well briefly, but that was enough, okay? That was a lot of reading. Thanks for your attention. But this miracle is an impactful one, as I had just said. It really is laid alongside the feeding of the 5,000 as the one that really stuck in people's minds in a big way. But the reason this miracle is so impactful is, at least in part, because of all of the messianic attributes of Jesus that we see on display at the same time. It's absolutely fascinating to see them. Great. So we're going to look at those now. Those are going to be our points. The messianic attributes of Jesus that we see on display as he rose Lazarus. First off, the first attribute that we see is that Jesus is fully divine. Did I mention, by the way, that I got outlines for you again? Did you guys get outlines yet? If you don't have outlines, they're on the bistro tables. I'm 2 for 2. You can use this to fill in and take notes. But Jesus is fully divine. The first attribute we see is he's fully divine. That is to say, Jesus is just as much God as God the Father is God. That's what we mean when we say Jesus is divine. And therefore, Jesus is in possession of divine power. This is something that Jesus himself had been saying all along. For example, in John chapter 5, Jesus said to the religious leaders, and I quote, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." And in response to this, it says of the religious leaders, "For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." And so he was saying this, and the religious leaders were understanding what he was getting at here. He had been stating his divinity all along, but in this miracle it's very interesting because we see his divinity on display. We see his power over death in action. Now, some of you might be reading and thinking to yourself, or some of you might be following along with this and thinking to yourself, well, this isn't the only time that he rose someone from the grave, is it? Lazarus, yes, that's one of them, but there were others. And in fact, the Gospels record 2 other instances where Jesus rose people from the dead. One of them was the widow's son at Nain, that is in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17, and also the daughter of Jairus, which is even more notable, and that takes place in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, but also in Mark. Both of these, though, are different because they took place relatively soon after the person died. In fact, the daughter of Jairus was raised only minutes after she had died. And that isn't to say that these were not fantastic miracles. They most certainly were. But they both happened within that threshold of time that the culture would have seen and said this is not necessarily unheard of. What I mean to say is that medicine then isn't what it is now. There were times that they looked at someone and assumed they were dead, and they were actually just in some kind of a deep coma or something of that nature, and they have woken up out of it. It didn't happen all the time, but it wasn't completely unheard of for someone to have been pronounced dead and then wake up because they made a mistake. They didn't realize that they were actually still there. Lazarus' story is different, and I think we were able to see this as we went through the text, but for the sake of being thorough here, I'll put this out to you now. The text is clear that when Jesus arrived on the scene. He was in the grave, dead in the grave, 4 days. His body had already been prepared for burial. He had already been laid to rest in the tomb, and the whole community had already been mourning his death for several days. And so his body had already been embalmed. The funeral was already in motion. Lazarus was long gone. His body had already begun decomposing, is the idea here. And this comes out in the text too. If you recall, when Jesus said, roll away the stone, it was Martha who said in verse 39, it hung up on me a little bit. Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, because he has been dead 4 days already. So no one in that scene was entertaining the slightest thought that Lazarus' death could be changed, not even Mary and Martha. And it's interesting when you look at it here, but those two said the same thing. All that they could say to him when he arrived was, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And in other words, both of them, when they said this, they were saying, if you had come sooner, you could have saved him. Maybe if you had come within a day after he died, you could have saved him. But now he's so completely dead that there's nothing more that can be done. Not even you can do anything at this point. Is implicit in that statement. If you had only been here, my brother could have been saved. With all this in mind, when Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb after he had been dead 4 days, his divinity was displayed to everyone looking on. And he showed in a very tangible way that he had power over death itself. Everyone saw that just as with God the Father, nothing is impossible for Jesus. And this can only mean that Jesus is divine. And by the way, Jesus is still divine. He is alive. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. And he is still able to do the impossible for us today. And with that in mind, are there things in your minds that are too impossible for Jesus to handle? Remember that he's divine. Remember that there is no burden that he can't bear. There's nothing that he can't do. And this is why Paul spoke of Christ in this way. I don't have it on the board, but jot this down. It's Ephesians 3:20. To him who is able to do far abundantly beyond all that we ask or even think. Why does he say something like that? Because he is so powerful, he can do the things beyond what we can even imagine. Where am I going with this? We tend to have limits. We tend to put God in a box. We tend to have things, this is the stuff that God does, and this is the stuff that God doesn't do. Maybe we don't use the word can't, but implicit is can't. Where am I going? Mary and Martha had that. They really didn't believe that Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the grave because he'd been dead so long. Even though Martha was saying, yeah, I believe you can, she was even indicating that she didn't believe he would, because when Jesus said, roll away the stone, she's like, whoa, he's decomposing, it's going to stink. She really hadn't wrapped her mind around the idea that Jesus was going to do this huge thing. And so don't be limited in your thinking, or at least be aware that we can be limited in our thinking and assume implicitly that the thing we need is too big for God. He's not going to do it, and we don't even bother asking. Put it out there. As crazy as it may seem, you might be surprised. He might just say yes. He is able to do beyond what we're able to ask or even think, because he's divine. But not only is he divine, he is also human. He's fully divine and fully human at the same time. Now, Christ's ability to be both fully divine and fully human at the same time is a great mystery that has been confounding the church since the very beginning. Systematic theology has labeled this concept the hypostatic union. Have you ever heard that fancy word used before? It's wrangled over to this day. How can he be both at the same time, and how do both of those attributes of him interact? And let me just save you a headache now. No one knows. It's not something we're really ever going to understand on this side of heaven, and that's okay. It's true nonetheless. Jesus is divine fully and human fully at the same time. And that is on display in this text in a really neat way through the emotion that is displayed by him as he performed this incredible miracle. Again, his divinity is displayed by doing the miracle. His humanity is displayed by the emotion that was present and displayed as he did the miracle. One of Jesus' most emotional scenes in the entire Bible is right here in this chapter, in John chapter 11. I'm going to put it up on the board for you so you can see it, okay? We read through it before, and we're going to look at it again. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, and said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying?" So Jesus, again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. And so we see a lot of emotion happening in this text. Two emotions in this text in particular. First, we see him deeply moved in spirit and troubled. This word that is used and translated deeply moved in spirit and troubled appears only 3 times in the New Testament, and each time it speaks of sternness or even anger. It's embrimaomai. It has been noted by scholars. It's sternness, it's anger, it's deep emotion there. The idea most believe is going on here is that Jesus saw all the people weeping and mourning and Lazarus, and his first response was to be moved with anger and to become angry at what they were experiencing and to be angry at death itself and the whole fallen situation that they were dealing with as a result of being born in that fallen world. And he literally raged inside against the source of their pain. But next we see that he also wept, all right? As Jesus continued to witness their pain, he shifted from being angry to being heartbroken, and he was moved to tears. And so what does this mean? It means that he deeply felt everything that they were experiencing. It means that he fully understood their pain. It means that though Jesus is fully connected with the infinite God of the universe and all of his wisdom and all of his power, he is equally connected to each and every one of us. Jesus' emotion shows us that God is present. It shows us that he deeply feels and understands every pain and every struggle that we have. And it shows that despite what we may think, God sees what's happening in our lives, he sees what's happening in the world, and he cares, all right? Not everyone believes that. A lot of people think that God couldn't care less. That's why all this stuff is happening. They're wrong. He sees it, and he cares, and he's heartbroken over it. And that's why the author of Hebrews said, and I quote, "We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, and yet without sin." God sees the pain you're experiencing. He sees the injustice of the world, and he does understand, and he does care. And that's why, as he was looking at everyone weeping and mourning at the tomb of Lazarus over something, and by the way, their pain that they were experiencing was in direct response to an action that he took in delaying. If he had come sooner, he could have raised him, and that might not have happened. They might not have been weeping and mourning for days if he had not delayed. He looked at their weeping and their mourning, which he caused, and he wept over it, all right? He felt, he understood the pain that he had caused, and it broke his heart, okay? That is very fascinating. It's very interesting. But you need to pair it with something else to really appreciate what's going on here, and that is the next one. Jesus is fully wise. He's fully wise. The third attribute that Jesus displays in this miracle is that he's fully wise. And we see Jesus' divine wisdom in 2 ways. First, we see it in the fact that Jesus understood the great purpose for Lazarus' sickness from the very start. When Jesus was informed of Lazarus' sickness, he responded, and I quote in verse 4, "This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified in it." Jesus went into this whole situation knowing what was happening and why, and what the end result would be. He understood it to begin with. Second, we see that Jesus' divine wisdom was displayed in the fact that he delayed his response. In verse 6, it says, and I quote, "When he heard that Lazarus was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was." What I don't point out here, which is what is also interesting, is that just before this, in verse 5, he said he loved Mary and he loved Martha. They're the ones that reached out to him and said, "The one who you love is sick." And it says Jesus loved them very much. And in response, he delayed and didn't go for 2 days. Fascinating. We'll talk about that in a minute. But most feel that Jesus was about a day's journey from Bethany at that time. And they get this from the fact that Lazarus, was dead 4 days by the time that Jesus arrived. And when you do the math, what you get is that there was a day's journey to find Jesus, in which Lazarus died soon after the messengers left, which is day 1. And then Jesus 2 days of delay wherever he was after being informed, which is day 2 and day 3. And then the journey back to Bethany from wherever he was, which was day 4. So with this in mind, even if Jesus had left immediately, Lazarus would have already been dead 2 days when he arrived. It already would have been pushing the envelope for him to arrive 2 days. But they might have been able to wrap their minds around it. But he delayed so that it would happen even longer. But from verse 4, we can see that Jesus seemed to understand how serious Lazarus' situation was and how pressed for time he was from the very beginning. And nonetheless, he intentionally chose to delay his departure 2 extra days after he had received the word. And what does this mean? It means several things exactly. It means that he knew better what everyone in Bethany needed than they did. It means that they appealed to him for help. And he was infinitely wise enough to answer their summons in the way that was best for them rather than the way they wanted. Make sense? They said, "Come now. Lazarus is in trouble." And he loved them deeply, but he was infinitely wise enough to delay so that his summons would be answered in the best way, not in the way that they wanted. It also means that it was necessary for everyone in Bethany to suffer heartbreak for a season in order for God's perfect plan to be realized. That's really sobering, but it's true. It was necessary for them to experience that pain in order for God's perfect plan to be witnessed and realized. If Jesus had just ended the whole thing sooner, like everyone else wanted, then his raising of Lazarus would not have had the climactic impact that it did. Does that make sense? In order to have the incredible impact, he could not get around the fact that people were going to be heartbroken for a time. He couldn't stop that from happening. There's so much we can do to talk about there in an application, but it's just really fascinating. And it also means, lastly, that Jesus was perfectly able to subordinate his intense feelings in the moment to the big picture. What do I mean here? Is that he was heartbroken over their pain. He did not want it to happen, but despite that, he was able to subordinate his own personal feelings to the will of God. We know from the last point how deeply Jesus felt everyone's pain in Bethany, and it was no doubt excruciating for him to delay his response, but his ability to see the big picture enabled him to do so. He was able to subordinate his feelings to God's will. He was able to bring his feelings in line to his will. Now, Nick is not in here right now, but, oh yeah, he is. He's right there. There is something to say, just in general, for that basic discipline and ability to subordinate our feelings to our will. And whenever I think about that, I think about me and Nick, because there was a time where me and Nick subordinated our feelings to our will when we were hanging up light bulbs in the sanctuary. I got a picture of him. I wasn't able to do it, but there's a picture of him on a bucket up there 35 feet in the air, putting in that dome light that's there now. And I can tell you every second that he was breathing, he was subordinating his feelings to his will, because he did not want to be up there in the worst way. He wanted to come down. I could feel the tension from down here. And I was like, well, I'm glad it's him up there, not me. I did think that. But that is something that we have to practice. But on an infinitely higher level, Jesus had to do that in order to be able to carry forth his will. This is not the only place that we see stuff like this happening. Honestly, the Garden of Gethsemane might even be a greater example, where he was sweating great drops of blood. And he was anguishing over the cross and what was coming. And despite that, he said, Father, if it is possible for this cup to pass over me, let it pass. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And so he's always about, he has these intense feelings towards us and an intense love towards us that we don't fully even appreciate or understand. But despite that, he's able to subordinate his feelings towards us, towards the Father's will, to achieve the ultimate result that he's aiming for. And in the same way today, we can feel abandoned by God as we go through struggles and pain, and we can feel like God doesn't care as we look on to the suffering of the world. And as much as we see Christ's humanity, as much as we see that he feels our pain, that fact alone can leave us wanting, because we can wonder to ourselves, if he truly does feel our pain, why doesn't he act? The answer is in the fact that Jesus is not only all-powerful and all-present, but he's also infinitely wise. He sees the big picture, and he knows how to give the world what they truly need. He loves us enough to delay, or even to deny us what we want, for the sake of what is best in the long run. And so God sees the suffering of this world, but he also sees the big picture, and he loves the world enough to respond to our struggles and our suffering with our long-term best in mind. Therefore, walking by faith requires us to struggle patiently and never lose hope. There's a lot of terrible things going on in the world right now, and do not think for a minute that God doesn't see it, and don't think for a minute that he doesn't anguish over it more than we do. And his delay in putting things right has nothing to do with him being disinterested or being uncaring. He is going for the best result for everyone. That's why it's happening, and someday we're going to see it. But for now, we look forward to it in hope. And lastly, Jesus is fully selfless. The last attribute we'll mention briefly in this miracle is that he's selfless. And this attribute is seen in the fact that Jesus raising Lazarus out of the tomb meant that he had to take his place. We see it in verse 46, where it says, "But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done." All right, and we know in the following verses that this information was used to stimulate a conspiracy theory, it initiated, I should say, a conspiracy, a plot against him. We see it in verse 53. So the raising of Lazarus was a climactic sort of sign in Jesus' ministry. It triggered his triumphal entry into Jerusalem as the Messiah. There was great expectation for him, but it also triggered the Jews' plans to crucify him, both at the same time. And Jesus knew that saving Lazarus' life would initiate the ending of his own, and that is fascinating. He did it anyway. He did it because he was about giving his life for other people. Following Jesus, by the way, is being selfless as well. It's about giving our lives, daily making choices to give our lives for other people. Now, in conclusion, something to think about. This miracle mirrors the cross in so many ways. As with Lazarus, Jesus was crucified, and he was verified dead, much like Lazarus. Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days, Jesus 3, but the same principle applies. They pierced his side from the cross and verified that he was dead. And then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took his body down and prepared it for burial, and also verifying that he was dead, and laid him in the tomb. Be clear about this. These details were given to us to verify 110% that Jesus was fully and completely dead when he was put in the tomb, like Lazarus was dead in the tomb. And yet, Christ overcame death by being raised from the grave. Now, there's a difference though. We are not seeking Lazarus' resurrection, which was basically a resuscitation into the world and the body that he already had. We are aiming for the resurrection to come, which is to put off this old body and a new body, and receive a new body and go into the kingdom of God. That is the resurrection that Jesus brought forth. That is the resurrection that we are celebrating at Easter time. And that is the one that I'm very much looking forward to. Amen.